I am Kanata, and I, that is we, villages of life that stretch from sea to sea to sea, a human constellation as long as the rivers run. Kanata, Kanacha, Canadian, we are Canadian. A seventh Kanata trait, vulnerability, would rank much higher, even top the list for Indigenous peoples. Before we jump to conclusions why this is so, let's look at how we use the word and how our use differs from and even dismisses its meaning for First Nations, especially those of the plains and tundra whose lives are centered around the bison and caribou, respectively. Walk the galleries of an interpretive center, or read the message on murals in northern airports, and you'll see the line, "We are people of the land," and how their livelihood, spirituality, and social life all derive from cycles of seasons, daylight and darkness, and the migration of wildlife. Whether they speak of the gifts of the Creator, Mother Earth, or living on Turtle Island, these are all declarations of vulnerability to the land life springs from. A bondedness to life as a whole contrasts with the imagined independence of those who came to make a life for ourselves. Settler people, especially those whose culture encouraged the stiff upper lip, see vulnerability as fragile, weak, needy, or sensitive, attributes once applied to women and children but not appropriate for grown leaders. These different ways of viewing vulnerability mirror our attitudes to land. Indigenous people see themselves as part of the land, non-Indigenous as apart from it. Land for settlers was a commodity to be surveyed, owned, broken, farmed, and developed. First Nations' resilience in surviving challenging conditions for millennia comes from their resourcefulness in working with the land, not against it. Women who built and moved lodges and sewed the coverings that kept winter's chill at bay were central. Their partnering, in bed and in business, with French and Scottish traders and voyageurs gave birth to the Métis, who successfully penetrated inland to trade, while English traders tended to remain on the coast and let others come to them. Métis voyageurs, plying waterways in the wake of First Nations, traveled an east-west network from Quebec to the Rockies. Their longest portage was less than a kilometer. If Americans had known this when they bargained for independence after their revolution, they'd have pushed for a border farther north. Then there would not have been a second country in North America. The spread of Kanata from the St. Lawrence to the Continental Divide is due to the resilience of First Nations and Métis living vulnerably on the land, until a Scot, Alexander Mackenzie, made the first transcontinental passage by land. The Canadian Pacific Railway followed 90 years later. A first non-Indigenous Arctic Ocean east-west passage succeeded where others failed because Norwegian Roald Amundsen and his crew of half a dozen took Inuit partners who helped them survive the winters, living vulnerably on the land and sea. In Cambridge Bay and Johaven, I met great-great-granddaughters of these women the summer of the 150th anniversary of Confederation. In 50 years after Confederation, we turned vulnerability and its players upside down in a crazy, mixed-up way we're now trying to untangle. First Nations, who had lived vulnerably, lost the run of the range, were put on reserves and subsidized to stay there. Well-meaning, ignorant outsiders suggested Indians would be better off if they'd give up the qualities that held them together and turn their land into a resource that could be leveraged. Doing this would repudiate the qualities by which they'd survived for millennia. Adaptive evolution is not the same as reprogramming. As land was cleared of those who'd moved freely over it, it was surveyed and divided. With the Métis, this began with long strip lots fronting on the rivers that were their highways, a model imported from Quebec. As English-speaking and other migrants spilled over west from Ontario and north from the U.S. Midwest, strips gave way to rectangular blocks surveyed in townships. In Alberta, traces of the French system remain along the Sturgeon and North Saskatchewan rivers, in St. Albert and Lamoureux, respectively. In Manitoba and North Saskatchewan, conflict over these systems between the Métis who'd lived on these lands for generations and homesteaders coming in with a land grant from a survey led to resistance. Two uprisings under Louis Ariel, 15 years apart. The once free range for hunting became free land for taking or sale, attracting masses of people prepared to live vulnerably as those they displaced on the land had done. Many had dreamed of owning land for themselves rather than working as tenants for others. For some, the adventure became a millstone round their necks. As Stan Rogers points out in his Saskatchewan song, Watch the Field Behind the Plough. Poor old Cusick down the road, the heartache, hail, and hoppers brought him down. He gave it up and went to town. And Emmett Pierce the other day took a heart attack and died at 42. You could see it coming on, 'cause he worked as hard as you. Others successful in amassing large spreads with herds and buildings saw later generations turn their back on this inheritance and leave for a job in the city. Along the way, cycles of rain, hail, and drought, particularly in the 1930s depression that turned prairie soil into drifting sand on an ancient sea bottom once again, led to a mass exodus from Saskatchewan that previously had been twice as populous as its western neighbor, to Alberta, where some turned to ranching and others to later work in the oil patch. The young who left for the cities to seek a fortune in sales and the suburbs retained a trace of the thirst to own land, but their mortgaged suburban lots gave vulnerability a different twist. Whatever equity they had was more likely to be leveraged for some future proposal, business, children's education, or retirement than an investment in the land as an end in itself. In the late 1930s, a herd of Canadian bison, a symbol of a bygone free range and indigenous livelihood, was exported to German game forests for Aryan youth to experience a mythic mega-world of the prehistoric past. This built a friendship between Canada's Prime Minister Mackenzie King and Reich Marshal Hermann Göring. Sadly, most of the animals did not survive the war. But the German connection continued through and after. German prisoners of war who escaped British camps were sent to Canadian ones, where the odds of their escaping in winter and making it home to Germany were lower. Some returned to live here after. One, Fritz Grunwald, composed My Country is My Cathedral, a song celebrating the Canadian landscape sung by youth for 3 generations. Lufthansa flies 3 times weekly into Whitehorse, where Germans experience whitewater canoeing, mountain climbing, and indigenous villages. Now 500 years since mainland contact began, as Cartier entered the river of Kanata, 400 since Champlain stayed year-round, 260 since the British came, treating with First Nations, and 150 since the Dominion of Canada moved them onto reservations, vulnerability is a set of paradoxes. First, for a vast majority of people who live in cities, vulnerability is largely economic, to street crime and homelessness, except for storms and power outages, where we must huddle together and depend on other regions for relief. Yet our 3 largest centers, Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver, are within 90 minutes' drive into the wilds of mountain and shield country. Others have national parks and wilderness areas nearby, like the holodeck of Starship Enterprise. Second, free range turned agricultural land for homesteads is no longer viable. Family farms are now a minority, outnumbered by hobby farms in commuting distance of city and town jobs that subsidize living on the land, and corporate agribusiness that pays workers as employees, reviving the tenant farms immigrants once left in Europe to face vulnerability of being their own bosses. Third, as Louis Ariel predicted his people would sleep a century and awakened, First Nations are doing that. On reserves are off. They are being vulnerable in business as they once were and still are on the land, without assimilating or mortgaging themselves. They may be the guardians of the Kanata spirit, rather than governments who have us in hock for state-subsidized benefits. A fourth aspect of vulnerability is political, spiritual, and one of attitude. Unlike French, English, Italians, Germans, South Africans, or you name it, we can't take Canada for granted. For a generation, Quebec had a question mark over it. Would it stay or leave the constellation? Quebec was not the first. Prince Edward Island, where Confederation talks began, dropped out and did not join for 4 years. A year after Confederation, Nova Scotians were talking of getting out, then British Columbia. Now Alberta and Saskatchewan are talking sovereignty within Confederation. This seems to be a rite of passage as each member of the constellation finds its voice. Quebec, that seemed in question for so long, was the first post-contact bedrock that led to today's Kanata, first to decide not to join Americans, and the place we found the indigenous V word, Kanata, village, not vulnerability, we eventually adopted as our name for the land we occupied. This uncertainty, that we can't take our constellation for granted, has turned out to be a gift. No majority can say we are Canada. Ontario sometimes tries with its population in the capital. We have to consult with each other before making up our minds, lest we lose our soul. For Kanata Connections and Consciousness, I'm David Watts.
Kanata, au long des rivières, les villages lumineux, au-delà des frontières, a human constellation, as long as the rivers run. Kanata, Kanata, Canadien, we are Canadian.